As Jerry noted, this morning we begin a long Faces of Our Faith worship series. In the coming weeks, we will get to explore lesser-known and overlooked biblical characters like Shiphrah and Puah, the midwives in Exodus, or Deborah in the book of Judges. But this morning we start at the beginning with Genesis 2, featuring Adam and Eve, who are among the most well-known and written about biblical characters. Where then are the lesser-known faces of our faith in Genesis 2? Though it may feel like a stretch at times for some of us, I'd like to suggest that we can find the lesser-known faces of our faith among the animals and among the ground in Genesis 2. Yes, the animals and the ground. Let's get into it. Starting with the animals, in Genesis 2, the Lord forms a single human before the other animals, which is a sequence that contradicts what we find in Genesis 1. Similarly, unlike Genesis 1, where everything God does is good, very good even at the end, something is not good in Genesis 2. The human is alone. So the Lord makes animals, hoping to find a suitable helper. But it doesn't work. And so after failing initially, the Lord tries again, creating a second human from the first. And the first human celebrates this new creature with the poetic bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh declaration that is the subject of the art accompanying today's service. While the text celebrates human connections in this way, the text also establishes some foundational connections between humans, animals, and the ground that I'd like to explore. According to verse 7, the first human is formed from the dust of the ground, a point to which I'll come back to in just a moment. Verse 19 says nearly the same thing about the animals, repeating both the verb form and the ground as the substance from which the Lord forms the animals. So in the way this text creates a world, humans and animals are of the same substance. Humans and animals also belong to the same class of beings, even though most translations will obscure the point. Both are described with the same phrase in Hebrew. They are nefesh hayah, living beings, as we heard Jim Brenneman remind us last week in Sermon Talk. I think this common origin and shared status as living beings might encourage us to consider the animals as our kin, our relatives. Perhaps we could then include them among the overlooked and lesser-known faces of our faith. What, though, would that mean about how we should live in relation to them? As the text doesn't address such questions directly, I'd like to leave them open, hopefully fodder for conversation. I'd like to turn to spend more time with the ground, the substance from which humans and animals are formed. On this, Genesis 2 utilizes a play on words to convey the connection between humans and the ground that is hard to convey in good English. The Common English Bible, for instance, translates Genesis 2:7 as, "The Lord God formed the human from the topsoil of the fertile land." The word for human is Adam, and the word for the ground is Adamah. So listen for it. The Adam is formed from the Adamah. To convey this sort of play on words, we might translate with a scholar like Ellen Davis, the human from the humus. Though I tend to mispronounce humus as hummus, which kind of misses the point, even if it's a bit humorous to think about. Sorry, too many hums there. Others have suggested maybe something like the earthling from the earth, though earthlings to me sounds a little bit like how the Area 51 aliens would view us humans. Greetings, earthlings. However we translate it, I think the play on words constructs a vital connection between humans and the ground. Reflecting on points like these, Sherry Hostetler puts it this way, quote, "We are made from the body of the earth, and our bodies are inextricably linked. We are not separate. We belong to Earth's body. With such ways as speaking about the ground and about the earth, I wonder, could we see the ground too as kin, our relative, perhaps with its own face even? Pondering such things, I was struck by a few elements in verse 6. A stream would rise from the earth and water the whole face of the ground, is how the New Revised Standard Version puts it. With the title then of our worship series, Faces of Our Faith, in my head, the phrase, the face of the ground, stood out to me. The Hebrew word translated as face is paneh, and it can have a range of meanings, including the surface of something. So other translations will read something like the surface of the earth. But let's linger to look at the face of the ground for a moment. Consider the larger phrase within which the text mentions the face of the ground. A stream would water the whole face of the ground. In a translation like this, the ground actually does nothing. Instead, something is done to it. The stream waters the ground. Now, there's a tricky concept in Hebrew here, but translating the phrase more wittingly, we'd end up with something like this. The stream caused the whole face of the ground to drink. With this translation, the face of the ground does something. It drinks water. Now, I think, accustomed as we are in Central California to droughts and parched lands, thinking about the ground as needing a drink might not be such a stretch. But it's just metaphor, right? The ground doesn't even have a mouth for it to drink. In fact, I think the idea of the ground having a mouth that can do things may have been more palatable to ancient writers of the Hebrew Bible than to some modern people. For instance, after Cain kills Abel, in a few chapters, God will say to Cain, "And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to take your brother's blood from your hand." Indeed, other texts in the Hebrew Bible can imagine supposedly inanimate nature, things like trees, rocks, hills, and so forth, doing things. In the text we heard from Isaiah this morning, the prophet can imagine the mountains and hills breaking forth in song before the people while the trees clap their hands. Studying texts like these, biblical scholar Mari Jorstad concludes that many texts, quote, viewed non-animal nature as active and alive. That is, as persons. In other words, some biblical texts appear not to confine the idea of personhood to humans. Personhood can extend beyond humans, an idea that's common amongst animist perspectives. Here, quoting Graham Harvey, Jorstad defines animism as living such that, quotes, "The world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in relationship with others." So as we pause to look at the ground in Genesis 2, noticing it has a face and drinks water, I wonder if we might begin to glimpse a world full of persons, only some of whom are human. A lesser known or overlooked face of our faith in the face of the ground. I confess that when I first heard Jorstad's argument about the world being full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that some authors of texts in the Hebrew Bible thought this way, I dismissed it. But I then started to reflect on some of the things that my daughter Charlie and I have done. When we used to go for daily morning walks, we'd come around a corner and step into the light of the sun. And when we would do it, we would greet it, "Good morning, sun." And we would thank it, "Thank you, sun, for your light, for your warmth, your energy, for helping our food to grow." Some years ago, as part of our bedtime routine with Charlie, we'd been reading Goodnight Moon, a storybook that walks through saying goodnight to things around the house like the moon and the stars. So one night I had an idea. Why don't we go to our backyard and say goodnight to the moon and the stars as well? So we walked to the backyard, and in the spirit of the book and surrounded by numerous others, I thought it fitting to say goodnight to our trees, especially the orange tree whose fruit we'd been enjoying every morning. And so we began to include the orange tree among our goodnights. We thanked it for its tasty oranges. And the list over time has grown. The blueberry bushes, the persimmon tree, and so on. And so I found myself talking to them, treating the trees as conversation partners. To be sure, I don't see the world as full of persons, only some of whom are human. I've been too conditioned to view things like trees, water, or the ground as just that, things. Things to be used rather than beings with whom I live in relation. But I've started to wonder, what might happen if I stopped asking whether such ways of thinking were true and lived as if they were? I think the ethical implications could be profound. Jorstad, again, writes poignantly, quote, "Mountaintop removal, clear cutting, aggressive use of fertilizers and pesticides, and careless oil drilling looks very different when these acts are not only extractive resource management, but also dysfunctional relationships with persons created and valued by God." If we were to bring Jesus' words about the least of these into conversation with the rest of creation, what else might we hear? Imagine the ground, for I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. Unlike with the animals, Genesis 2 does provide some hints about the ethical obligations of the first humans with respect to the ground. To till it and to keep it is how the New Revised Standard Version puts it. But as Ellen Davis would point out, a translation like this might give the impression that the key tasks have primarily agricultural connotations, something like working the land. The terms, though, have a wider range of meaning as they deal with interpersonal relationships. The word translated as till is avad. It means to serve, as in a slave working on behalf of another, a master. It is what the Israelites did for Pharaoh. They served him. So the first task is serving the land. The word the NRSV translates as keep is shamar. It often means protect, as in a person protecting a sibling or a flock of animals. It can also mean, though, to observe, as in paying attention to someone or something. But most typically, shamar means to observe or to obey God's commandments. We could say that it means to live up to the expectations that God has set for the people. And so as we come back to the land with these sort of connotations in mind, the second key task would mean things like to protect the land, to observe it, to live up to the expectations the land has for us humans. I'm conscious that this morning I have often been suggestive, posing as many questions as wonderings, as answers. The idea that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, is new to me. I look forward to inquiring together with all of you about what following Jesus among these overlooked and lesser-known faces of our faith would involve. May we find ourselves transformed in the process. Amen.